Hello and welcome back to the Holistic Homes Podcast. I'm Christine, licensed general contractor here in California and construction consultant nationwide. And today's episode is an important one and often incredibly overlooked. And it has to do with your mechanical system. And this is going to apply to both renovations and custom new builds. And I want to share with you some of the biggest red flags that I see, definitely how you can avoid and steer clear of some of these. And I want to share with you a story of a project that recently came up that really sparked this topic in my mind. So first I want to share with you some of the red flags to look for, and these often come up in conversation or just in the flow of your project. Red flag number one is going to be early on in your project if there is actually no mechanical plan whatsoever, meaning there is no mechanical designer or engineer that is doing an entire layout for your home. And this definitely applies to renovations. Yes, even renovation projects should have a mechanical plan. And what I mean by having no mechanical plans whatsoever is the dreaded phrase of, "We work it out after framing." And this is so commonly heard in that the mechanical crew will come in after your home is already framed. If you're doing a renovation, it's likely that your home is already completely framed and the mechanical crew or the mechanical installer is going to show up on site, have a meeting with you and your contractor, and walk the job to determine where the registers will be, where the return is going to be, where the mechanical equipment is going to live. And so often that just ends up, oh, we'll just throw it up in the attic or we'll put it in this closet. There's no thought at all put into the mechanicals prior to the framing stage, which is a huge red flag. Reason being is that there should absolutely be a dedicated mechanical closet, a mechanical space within your building enclosure, which means it is within the same heating and cooling space as the rest of your home. So if your attic is a traditionally ventilated attic, meaning you have outdoor air within your attic, and they're just putting the mechanical equipment up in the attic, that's a red flag that it wasn't thought through. Mechanical equipment should never be within an unconditioned space. It's going to greatly reduce the lifespan of the equipment and also lead to air leakage, meaning it is pulling in air that is not a part of your conditioned space. So red flag number one is going to be if there's no mechanical plan, no dedicated space for the mechanical equipment, and if they are planning to just walk the job after it's framed. This is a big no-no. The reason that I really emphasize this first one is because when you're building a healthy home, indoor air quality is one of the highest areas of importance. And when you have a team that is not prioritizing that and just saying, we'll take care of it after framing, you're going to be limited in the size of duct runs that you can have, the space that you have for the equipment. It is showing evidence that it is not their highest priority, and they're just going to deal with it after the fact. So that's red flag number one. Red flag number two is going to be, again, going back to not having the plan, but when they are walking it after framing, red flag number two is that if they have not coordinated the mechanical plan with the structural engineer. And this has come up quite a bit in that it's not thought through of how the structural beams, how your floor joists, how trusses, how all of the required structural components of your home will impact the mechanical duct runs. And this is sometimes referred to as like clashing, where ideally they are taking the structural plan and they are overlaying it with the mechanical plan, and they are seeing where there are clashes in the planning stage, meaning this is all happening as your plans are getting through design development and construction documents. There needs to be the structural and the mechanical talking to each other. And if you are planning a renovation and maybe that's not the case, there still needs to be this overlay of someone having eyes on your project to determine if there are structural members in the way of where your mechanical equipment needs to run. Because again, going back to prioritizing indoor air, you want to prioritize the size of the ductwork and where it needs to run. An example of this would be on one of our recent projects where we were involved in the early floor plan developments. And a question I had asked the architect is, what is the proposed floor joist space? This was a 2-level home. And I had said, what do you currently have in your model for the space between the 2nd level and the 1st level? And they had shared with me, they had planned for 12-inch floor joists. That's tiny. That is a big concern when prioritizing ductwork, because you're now restricted to that size of ductwork. Typically about 8 inches of ductwork can get through that floor joist. But in the name of indoor air quality and proper air balancing, you might need much larger ductwork to run through there. But if your home is built with 12 inches of floor space, that's what you're limited to. And so we were able to have this conversation very early on, where we had the mechanical designer in the meeting, and we had determined early on, hey, we're gonna actually need 24 inches of space between the 2nd level and the 1st level to get the correct size of ductwork through there. And that changed everything in their plan. It was early on, so it was not a huge ordeal, but the height of the home got 12 inches taller, it affected the stair treads. And so it impacted everything, but we were still in that design development stage. And so things were able to change. But if we had not had that conversation and the home had been framed, it would have been a completely different story. And we would not have been able to get the appropriately sized ductwork through the floor joist in that home. And so walking the project after it's framed to then determine the best path for indoor air quality is a huge red flag. Back to red flag number 2 is if you are not having your structural plan talk with your mechanical plan, you are likely to have some clashes during the actual construction. And you're going to be limited on what you can do with the mechanicals. Okay, and then red flag number 3 is going to be all talk about heating and cooling and no talk about controlling indoor humidity levels and bringing in fresh air. This goes back to numerous conversations that I've had where this was not ever a conversation in the planning stage. And the reason this is a big red flag is homes today in most states are required to be pretty airtight, somewhere between 3 to 5 air exchanges per hour. That's referred to as an ACH 50 number, and the 3 or the 5 is referring to how many complete air exchanges are happening within your home within 1 hour. And this is a number that needs to be a target in your project. Renovation, new build. There needs to be an ACH 50 target. You have to know what you are setting as the goalpost. How airtight is your home going to be? Are you shooting for a number that is 1 or below? Are you shooting for a 3, 5? What is the number that's the target? And you'll be able to determine what the number actually is through a blower door test. So if this targeted number is not discussed during the planning stage, that tells me that nobody is really strategizing on what is the system for the home. How airtight are we planning to build this thing or renovate it? And that targeted number, let's call it a 1 ACH 50, 1 full air exchange per hour. That's pretty airtight. That design goalpost should be provided to the mechanical designer to know how to design the mechanicals for your home, meaning that they are going to design the fresh air that is brought into the home. They're going to design the humidity control. They're going to design how much heating and cooling you need, all based off of this ACH 50 target of 1 air exchange per hour. There's other factors that go into it, like windows and R value, but determining how airtight or how leaky the home is something that needs to be discussed and calculated in the mechanicals of your home. Not talking about bringing in fresh air is a huge issue, because as we make homes tighter and tighter and tighter, you are not getting fresh air brought in through the walls. Like an older home, we'll call it like a 1950s home that was maybe even built without any insulation in it. Maybe now it has some insulation. If you were to do a blower door test on an older home, it's likely to have somewhere around like 30 air exchanges per hour. It's super high because there's just so much air moving through those walls and coming into your home. That's not the best strategy because you can't control the indoor environment. You can't control indoor humidity and indoor air quality. And so as we tighten up the walls, we need to be bringing in controlled fresh air. And that is how you are getting air exchanges within your home. But you are bringing in fresh air, and then it's ideally getting filtered. And now you are in control of the interior fresh air that is moving throughout. So if you are having conversations that are only around heating and cooling, and they are not discussing how they're going to control indoor humidity and how they're going to control indoor fresh air, and even potentially indoor air pressure via like makeup air, which is another topic, that is a red flag. So red flag number 3 is related to not having a plan in place that addresses the humidity, the fresh air, any potential makeup air needed. Like, this is a whole system. Going back to your home is a system. It's not an a la carte menu. It's not picking a little bit of this type of insulation and no VOC paint, and we'll put in this type of exterior waterproofing. The whole system needs to make sense, and there needs to be a goalpost for how airtight and how your home is going to perform. Okay, then when it comes to red flag number 4, this is a very common one, and I think it is contributing to a lot of issues within homes that are built even today. And it has to do with, if you are coming across somebody that's going to be doing the mechanical install and they're simply looking at square footage and then determining how many tons of equipment your home needs, that is a huge, huge red flag. So what I mean by like the square footage and the tons or the amount of equipment you need, that is not how a healthy home is going to have optimal indoor air. An example would be if you hear, okay, you've got a 3,000 square foot home. All right, let's plan to put 4 or 5 tons of equipment in there. That is not going to lead to a uniquely designed system for your home based off of how airtight your enclosure is. That is likely to be incredibly oversized. If you have a really good enclosure, that is a ton of equipment and a ton of air moving throughout and a lot of humidity, condensation. It's a trickle effect. But if you are working with a team that is asking how many square feet is a home and then this is how many tons you need, that's not enough data to be prioritizing like indoor air quality. So an example would be, how do we calculate how much equipment you need within your home? How do we calculate the load calcs, which is what it's often referred to? That is where the manual J calculation comes into the picture. What's interesting is that this was not always a requirement. It was typically just the square footage and how many tons. Over the years, there's a 2009 building code that came into effect that began to require manual J calculations, meaning that there would actually be load calcs for the project. But not every state has adopted that. That's, I believe, only 29 states require a manual J calculation for a new mechanical system. And even at that, just a simple load calculation is not going to give you enough data to determine the optimal mechanical equipment needed for your home. And there's other calculations. There's a manual D that's going to size the ductwork that's needed. There's a manual S that's going to determine equipment selection. So there is a whole set of mechanical plans, drawings, ideally even 3D images of the layout, and full specifications of the mechanical equipment that should be prioritized in the renovation or the new build. And so if you are hearing about square footage and how many tons, that's not enough data. And each state is a little bit different. There's states that require a manual J calculation. There's some states that require all three. Like here in California, we have something called Title 24, where you need all three of those calculations. I still see a ton of loopholes and not properly calculated equipment sizing. And the biggest thing I see is indoor humidity set points extremely high, like 70%, meaning that all of these calculations are targeting 70% indoor humidity, which in the healthy home space, we do not want our indoor humidity at 70%. It would be much more comfortable and ideal around the 50% mark. So red flag number 4 is going to be around every home gets the same equipment. Every 3,000 square foot home gets the same amount of equipment, same layout. That's a big red flag. And you should be talking with the team, ideally in the planning stage, about doing the calculations and the proper sizing of equipment based on your unique home. Doesn't matter about the square footage. It's the square footage plus the enclosure plus the indoor humidity like benchmark and plus how much fresh air. Like all of this is a system. Your home is a system. Those are my 4 big red flags to look out for if you're hearing these conversations come up early on in your project, or maybe you are already midway through your project and the mechanical installer is planning to show up next week to determine what's going to go in. So some red flags there to look out for. But let's talk about what should happen and what we really prioritize on all of the projects that we consult on is very early conversations around mechanicals. So a typical conversation we'll have meetings with the architect, with the owner, with the builder, ideally as well. And during the design development stage where the floor plan and the exterior elevations are taking shape, this is where we have the conversation on looping in the mechanical designer. And this is before anything goes over to structural as well. So once we've dialed in the floor plan and the exterior, this is when our team will start to have building enclosure conversations, good, better, best strategies on how is this going to get airtight, watertight, what are we prioritizing here on exterior finishes. So once we have a system and we know how we're treating the attic space, how we're treating the exterior walls, any below grade walls, once we have that dialed in, right then is when we need to loop in the mechanical designer or engineer. And then we have the conversation around the priorities and air balancing and how the home is used. We have a home that had a large entertaining space, and at certain points throughout the year, there would be over 150 bodies within this entertaining space. Well, we need to plan for that. We need to have equipment and duct sizing that can handle what's referred to as excursion spaces that can handle a party and still make that space comfortable. You've probably been to parties within a home and it was just hot and sweaty because the mechanicals were never planned for that type of event. So having the conversation on how the space is used, maybe this is a vacation home that's rarely ever occupied and there's just a husband and wife that enjoys the space a couple of times a year. Well, The mechanical system needs to be designed around that to be able to maintain the home in a comfortable environment even when it's not in use. So having the conversation early on after the floor plan and the exterior elevations are fairly dialed in, and then the mechanical conversation begins. And they're taking information about what are the windows that are going to be used, what are the exterior walls, what is the attic, where is the equipment going to go, where is there a mechanical closet that is appropriately sized for the equipment that needs to go in there. In some cases, we have projects that have very high, beautiful vaulted ceilings. Wonderful. We need to plan for how are we going to get mechanicals on both sides of this vaulted ceiling if ductwork cannot go up and over. So we then need to have 2, maybe more, dedicated mechanical closets on the separate wings of the home. And so that all goes into the floor plan. Then from there, the mechanical plan goes over to the structural engineer, saying, this is where we want to run our ductwork. Can we make sure that we're not going to have any big structural beams in the way? Because we can't cut giant holes into structural beams. And that is a conversation. So then ideally, when construction begins, structural is free and clear of where mechanicals need to go, and there's sufficient space within floor joists so that ductwork can get in there, plumbing can get in there, electrical, like there's enough space for everybody. You don't want to end up framing your home to then figure out where the mechanicals are going to go, because in that case, they're just not prioritizing how your home's going to breathe and how it's going to maintain humidity. So that's a little bit about how the ideal process goes. There's certainly some back and forth and modifications that are made, but so much better to do that on a piece of paper with your floor plan than after your home is framed. So that's what I have for you today, the 4 red flags to look out for, a little snippet of what the ideal scenario looks like. But if you want to learn more about how our team can consult on your project, ideally in the planning stage, but if you already are getting wheels in motion for construction, you can reach out to us on Instagram. We'll share a link below. Reach out to us, send us a DM, tell us a bit about your project, and we'd love to connect with you to see how we can help, even in the mechanical stage. So thank you so much for listening and being here, and I will see you on the next episode.